Hi, I'm Brooke Bellamy, and today I'm going to show you all of the essential things you need to start baking from home, as well as a few of the things that you don't need. One of the questions that I get asked the most is, what mixer should you buy? The truth is that you don't have to buy the most expensive mixer for it to be good. The best mixer that you can buy is the one that you can afford. We're gonna start with the top of the line, which is a stand mixer. I've been using these in the bakery for a really long time, so I'm most accustomed to using a stand mixer. I love the stand mixers because it's a little bit easier. You can kind of plonk everything in the bowl while you're getting ready. Maybe you're measuring out the eggs or the next ingredient. You can keep the mixer running, so it's kind of the most efficient way. The next most affordable option, which is one of these handheld mixers. So these ones are really good if you have a bit of a lower budget, but you still want to get a mixer, especially if you're doing things like making a meringue, anything that needs a lot of mixing or whipping. You do want one of these options. It just makes it a lot easier and a lot quicker when you're baking. You can make brownie batters, cookie doughs, anything that you want to do, and you can also use the whisks to whip up a meringue. And then the third option, you won't read about this much, but you can actually just get away with using a wooden spoon. This is obviously the cheapest option to mix your baked goods, but it is also just a really good option. If this is all you have, you can still make a lot of recipes just with a wooden spoon. And then the next thing you're gonna need to get everything out of the bowl is a spatula. So I use a lot of different spatulas in the bakery, but the most common one that you would find at home is just one of these regular spatulas. You can also get smaller sizes, which are really good for getting things out of jars, like maybe getting to the bottom of a peanut butter jar. The other thing that I find really useful in the bakery, I don't use them so much at home, is a dough scraper. I use it less at home because I'm more inclined to just use a regular scraper, but they're also really good. The next thing I would recommend buying is a whisk. You're gonna use this for lots of things. I quite like to use this one just for scrambled eggs in the morning. You can whip up lots of things with a whisk. It's always really handy to have, especially if you don't have a stand mixer or a handheld mixer, because those ones will have the attachments as well. Bear with me. For the stand mixer, I typically will use, people call these different things, beater, paddle attachment, however you want to call it, but this is like the most typical attachment that I would use for the mixer. But then making like a meringue or anything, then I will be using this attachment. It's also really good for just whisking air into whatever you're making. Brownies, I also sometimes will use this for the eggs so that you get those nice crackly tops. Otherwise, I would say 9 times out of 10, I'm using the standard beater. Next up is some baking trays. I have a few different sizes because sometimes you might be baking like just a couple of cookies. Sometimes you might want to put an entire batch of 6 or 8 cookies in the oven. So I do recommend getting some different sizes. And then if you have baking trays, you obviously need baking paper. Okay, next up is my cake pans. I have lots of different sizes of cake pans in the bakery. We use every size from 4 inches up to about like maybe 10 or 12 inch cake pans. The most common size for recipe books sits somewhere between like a 6 and a 9 inch pan. I like to have 8-inch pans on hand at all times. I always use an 8-inch for, cakes for like celebrations. If you're baking for someone else, I find this the most common size. If you want to make a mini cake like we make in the bakery, we also have those are a 4-inch size pan. The other thing to think about, which not a lot of people talk about, especially in recipe books, is that this is quite a shallow pan. So the other thing you might want to invest in is having a higher pan. So these are both 8-inch cake pans. However, this one is a little bit more shallow, and then this one has a little bit more height. And that's great if you're making a bigger cake or you want more cake inside your pan. The other pan that I always use, and you guys know I always use this, is a cupcake tray, because we make lots and lots and lots of cupcakes in the bakery. And they're also a really one to make at home and to take to a celebration. So I do recommend having at least one cupcake tray. This one is an 8-inch, and then when I'm lining these, I'm just using the cupcake patty pans to go in each of these. A spring release ice cream scoop. This is how I release all of the batter for the cupcakes. Really easy way just to portion your cupcake batter, and then you get perfectly consistent cupcakes every time. If you have the exact same measurement, the same weight in each of those pans, when they bake in the oven, they bake completely consistently and they're exactly the same and you don't get that variation. Alrighty, what else? We have got, a rolling pin is like an essential. I don't think there's much more to say about that. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can also, so long as you can find something in this shape that you can roll, it's fine. But I do find that a rolling pin is really handy to have around. You guys know I like to measure everything with scales. This one is like a $10 set. They're not that expensive to buy. And when you get used to measuring everything with scales, you'll find that your baking is a lot more accurate. It's something I never used to do growing up. I would just use cups and teaspoon and tablespoon measurements. But as I have been baking professionally, I find that my results are a lot more consistent if I use scales. That said, a lot of recipes and recipe books will use cups and spoons. So mostly I will measure everything, but one of the things I don't usually measure is baking soda and baking powder. Also salt, I usually do that just by the eye. But it's always handy to have a set of tablespoons and teaspoons and measuring cups handy. The other thing I've got here is a cooling rack. I like to have a nice big one on hand. Then if you're doing multiple cakes, I would fit 3 cakes onto here. But it's also really handy for cooling down cookies, your brownies straight onto something instead of the countertop. I would say I have 6 or 7 of these in different sizes. I definitely recommend having a sieve on hand. I like to sieve my Dutch cocoa powder always because otherwise it's really clumpy and it doesn't break down in the recipe. So always really good to have this on hand. I don't usually sieve my flours. You don't typically need to unless they have clumped together if they've been sitting inside your pantry for a while, but always handy to have on hand. So mixing bowls, I like to have some smaller ones as well, just to measure out all of my ingredients in advance. I am a big believer in mise en place. If you don't know what that is, it's a fancy French term for measuring everything out before you start baking. There has been multiple occasions where I will forget the eggs in a cake recipe and it ends in disaster. So I like to measure out everything in advance and have it there sitting in front of me so I look at it and I know it has to go in the bowl and it goes in the recipe and in the oven. As you start baking, I do find that there might be something that you sway more towards in the beginning, like cookies are really popular right now. They're having their moment. But once you have mastered cookies, you might be more interested in upskilling and learning different skills, which is great because you're on the exact right YouTube channel for that. And when we go through the cake decorating masterclass, you will need a turntable. These are really handy to have if you are decorating cakes. So this one basically just rotates the cake as you decorate it. And the other thing I always use in cake decorating is an offset spatula. These are really good for placing buttercream onto your cakes and then moving it around the cake so that it's nice and even. And then the last thing for cake decorating, which I would recommend, is a cake scraper. I've got 2 different sizes here of cake scrapers. This tall one is great if you're making a tall cake, like maybe you've layered a 4-layer or a 6-layer cake. And then I like these smaller ones for our heart cakes that we do a lot of in the bakery. You only need one. If you're gonna buy one out of these 2, I would say buy the larger one because you can do small cakes and large cakes with this one size. The last thing I would recommend getting is a sugar thermometer, especially if you're getting into things like macaron making. This is essential if you're making macarons. A sugar thermometer is just going to measure the temperature of the sugar, and when you're making macarons, you don't want to get it wrong. There are certain points of the recipe, 112 degrees, 118 degrees. As that is rising in temperature, you need to be watching the sugar before you pour it into your meringue. Just any sugar work, any caramels that you're doing, it's always good to monitor your sugar with a sugar thermometer. So that's everything you do need to get started baking. Now let's talk about some of the things you probably don't need, or maybe you might invest in them later down the line, but some of these things I purchased early on and I realized I don't really need all of them. One of the things that I think you could probably skip is one of these old school sieves or sifters. I used to use this when I was small and I was baking with my mom, and they're handy. I think they're fun if you're baking with kids because it does keep it from going everywhere. But I think if it's just yourself baking from home, This also does the same job. So if you got one of these, you don't need one of these. When I first started baking, and kind of embarrassingly, actually maybe even up to like a year or two ago, I didn't really realize the difference between cake pans and these spring release pans. These ones you really only need for making cheesecakes. So if you're not making a cheesecake, you probably don't need to invest in the ones with the little spring release, which is basically a really easy way to get your cheesecake out so that it doesn't stick all around the sides. You don't really need them for anything other than cheesecake. The next thing you probably don't need to invest in is one of these dough scrapers. The ones that I do like to use in the bakery are the half moon silicone ones, and then you can scrape things out of the bowl. But these ones you can't really use for that. You can't scrape the sides of a bowl with these straight edges, and it's also quite sharp. Unless you are working with pastry dough, you probably won't need one of these just yet. Finally, this one's a little contentious, but silicone baking mats. Are they good or are they bad? I find that silicone baking mats are good for certain things, but not for others. Maybe it's just my recipe, but I never get success from using silicone baking mats with cookies. So I no longer bake cookies on them. I always have to use a baking pan and traditional old baking paper, because these ones, I find that the cookies will spread on the silicone baking mats. However, that being said, I do use silicone baking mats when I am making macarons. I find this is so much better to get consistency every time when you're piping each of those macaron shells. You can follow the guidelines on these, and they also just like peel off really nicely from the silicone baking mat. Okay, now that we've talked through all of the essential equipment that you need, let's chat through some of the essential ingredients that you should always have in your pantry or your fridge on hand. So obviously flour and self-raising flour. It kind of depends where you're watching from around the world, because self-raising flour is really popular in Australia. However, I have found that since releasing the cookbook, a lot of people have DM'd me or emailed to say we don't have self-raising flour where we are. So if you don't, I will be sure to leave a little note in the description box for how to make SR flour. Essentially, self-raising flour is just a mix of plain flour and raising agent like baking powder. So I'll leave a little recipe in the description box below, but we do use both flours in the bakery, and I use both of these at home. Next we have our sugars. So we've got our white sugar and our brown sugar. This one is a light brown sugar. When we talk about a dark brown sugar, that just means that it's an increased ratio of molasses. So you have more molasses in the dark sugar, which means more of that caramel, really rich caramelized sugar flavor. But I like a light brown sugar. I always have that on hand. And then for white sugar, you can use regular white sugar, or you can also use caster sugar. I personally prefer to always bake with caster sugar because it's a little bit finer than a regular sugar. So it's more dusty, so it's like a finer consistency. Caster sugar, then when you bake, so I use this in all of our cookie recipes, it means that it's not grainy when you bite into the cookie. It's like really nice and like light texture, and then just like melts away in your mouth. So I always bake with caster sugar. You don't have to, white sugar will do the same thing. You can always substitute them out. Raising agents, I've got baking powder and bicarbonate of soda. Both of those I use all the time. For salt, I like to use sea salt flakes. It's a little bit bougie and one of those things that I'm happy to spend a little bit more money on because I really love a good salt. And in baking, you will use salt a lot to draw out all of those natural flavors and just balance out the sweetness with a nice little bit of salt. I always like to use unsalted butter in all of my recipes. Unsalted butter is better in baking because then you can control the amount of salt that you put inside the recipe. And then I've got my Dutch cocoa powder, which is like alkalized cocoa powder, so nice and rich profile. I've got a dry yeast. I don't bake a lot with yeast, but I am really excited to start learning how to do so with you guys here on this channel. And then I've got two of the most common spices that I use in baking. Cinnamon, I love in anything. Cinnamon scrolls, I put this in like a banana bread. I love, love, love cinnamon. And then the next best thing would be a nutmeg is really nice in baking in the fall or autumn. All right, so that's everything you will need in your essential equipment and all of your ingredients. If there's anything that you think I missed or anything that you would add to your baking kit, be sure to leave a comment below so that you can help out our community, because now it's time to get down to the fun stuff, and that is to start baking.